Today we'll be covering our recommendations for refreshing your database as you prepare for the new year. So we'll be going through a list of tips and tricks to help you keep your database in top shape that we recommend at least considering on an annual basis. Now, for some people, that makes a lot of sense in the new calendar year. And for others, it's more prudent to do these things during a slower period of your year, or perhaps at the start of a new fiscal year. But to start off, we're going to look at your volunteer application and volunteer profile information. Then we'll move into some general database cleanup for volunteers as a whole, your groups, your opportunities, and then just a couple things to consider in terms of how your system matches your website and how you're directing volunteers, things that are kind of worth considering on an annual basis. So that's our plan here for today. So the end of the year is a good time to make changes to the information on your volunteer application and perhaps request volunteers to update their application information. So I always want to point out your volunteer application is not necessarily static. You can certainly change that as you need to. Now, if we look at adding a new volunteer under the volunteer management heading, this is the admin perspective of your application. This is similar to what your volunteers see, but it's not the same thing. But the data that you see here, what you're collecting from volunteers, the order of these questions as they're presented, this is all something that you can modify in your system configuration. So it's always good to keep that in mind. You do not necessarily need to stick with a legacy system if you inherited it from someone else and there's some data that you want to collect or capture, you can always make those changes. So the end of the year is kind of a good time to consider that. If we look in the system configuration under system management, there are two sections that pertain to your application or to data collection generally. One is called information collection, and the other is called custom volunteer profile fields. So this is really where you configure what questions you're asking of your volunteers, how they're formatted, how they're presented, what order they're laid out in. You can obviously customize that through here. So if we open up the information collection section, generally speaking, these are pretty standard fields, things that you might typically see on an application. But you can go through and toggle these on and off. Some of them allow you to make changes to the field itself. So for example, you have these sections where you have additional selection options where you could change what's offered or add in new fields. These are, editable in that sense. I do want to point out any of these sections where you're kind of editing the options that are presented. So like, for example, the t-shirt field. If you're editing these options, you just add a comma between the different options that you'd like to present, and then those will be given to volunteers to select between using like a drop-down menu. And these are sorted. Left to right is effectively top to bottom in that drop-down menu. So you can always come in here, remove things from this list, add things to this list. These have pretty generous character fields, so there's a lot of options to kind of configure that. Again, with that said, a lot of these options in here, you might just toggle on and off. And of course, if you have any questions about, well, what is this information collecting? Why would I utilize this? There's some information boxes here that provide some additional information. We also have customer support documents on a lot of these items as kind of independent entities. And of course, you can always ask our customer support team if you have questions about why you might want to track something or if it's possible to track something. So again, these are kind of the default fields in here. Below that, we have what we refer to as the liability waiver or medical release, and then also terms and conditions. Now, the liability waiver or medical release, that's actually not necessarily what this is tracking. This is more like a paper waiver. So you're asking volunteers to sign something. So basically print it out, download it, print it out, sign it, and then return it to you. So if you have some kind of paper waiver that you need volunteers to sign and then return back to you, that's essentially what this is for. The terms and conditions are more like a digital signature, right? So this can be a part of your application as well, where volunteers are checking a box and signing your terms. If you haven't seen these before, I do just kind of want to point out what these look like. So let me take us to the volunteer application page here. So at the bottom of the volunteer application, you'll see a checkbox with your intro text. The actual terms will be below that. And of course, you edit all of this information. And then a volunteer types in their signature here. So a volunteer is signing these terms when they create a profile. If you have this enabled in your console, a volunteer cannot create an account without agreeing to these terms. So this is a pretty nice way to round out some of that kind of info, like photo release, volunteer code of conduct. Maybe you have like an indemnity, hold harmless, liability waiver, medical release, things like that. It's typically what we see through here. But this is up to you, and volunteers are signing this. When they do sign it, it gets tacked onto their profile as a document, which you can then go and download if you need to. And like what we're talking about today, you might have volunteers who have already signed these terms, but you want to ask them to sign them again. The system keeps track of how old these signatures are. So when a volunteer signs your terms, that gets stored in their profile as a document. So let's back up here and look at an example. If I go into my volunteer database, I'm just going to go down to an example that I have. And if we click to view profile details for a volunteer, scroll about halfway through, we'll see this accepted terms and conditions date. So this will store up to 10 documents. You can see for each of these, because I'm an administrator, I can go in here and download or delete these signed terms. So if I wanted to remove a signature, I could do that. Maybe it was an error or you noticed an error and you want them to re-sign it. You can go and manipulate that or remove it. You can't sign on their behalf. But you can also go in and download these terms. This basically just produces a PDF copy of those signed terms. So it has the volunteer's contact info. Below that, the terms themselves. So what did they agree to? What did they actually say when they signed them? And then below that, their signature information. Now, like I said, you can ask volunteers to re-sign these terms. So you can see this has the date of when this person agreed to those terms. So the system knows how old this is. If this date is greater than 1 year, the system will ask the person to re-sign those terms if they're updating their profile. And you can also kind of force that by changing your terms. Service knows when did you write the terms. So it will keep track of when did you last make a change to the terms and conditions. So if you make a change to your terms, perhaps you just add in the calendar year in the title. Well, this is technically a new set of terms because it's got different language in here. So the system knows that. And then when a volunteer updates their profile, they'll be asked to re-sign those terms. One other kind of last component of that, and this also goes hand in hand with what we were talking about in terms of making changes to your application, is you can force volunteers to update their profile the next time that they engage with you by setting something called requiring verification of volunteer profile information, which does exactly what it sounds like. It's basically a setting that you can toggle on a volunteer's profile or for a set of volunteers at one time. Typically, this is kind of done for your whole volunteer database at once. So if we back up here, we can go into the volunteer database. We can search for everyone by leaving the search bar blank. Click Search Volunteer Database. Select all of your results using the checkbox in the heading. Even if you have multiple pages of results, they will all be selected. Up at the top here, under the drop-down menu, we can go into Update these selected volunteer profiles. Click on the button that corresponds to that. And then in here, you're choosing, well, what do we want to bulk update, right? So if you wanted to, you could make changes to things on the volunteer profile. An example of that actually is clearing out custom fields. We didn't touch on custom fields quite yet, but you can reset the values there back to nothing. So that would require a volunteer to re-answer this question. So you can do things like that in here if you want to. You can also obviously bulk update whatever metric you want to on the volunteer's account. But what we're really talking about here is requiring verification of volunteer profile information. So if we click into this, we can say select items to bulk update. And you could choose multiple things here. But if we go ahead and select that, then the next page or the next option will say require verification. There's only one option here, and that's yes. And if we were to toggle this, click on update, it's going to say, hey, this is what you're about to do. You're updating 245 volunteers and you're requiring verification. We can say yes, proceed with bulk update. Now what that will do is it will force all of your volunteers to, the next time they log in, update their account information and make changes to their profile, right? So if they have any gaps in their application, like you've added a new field into the application, if you've added a new custom question, or if you've modified which fields you're collecting, perhaps you weren't collecting birth date before, but now you are, you can go in and update that information. And then when a volunteer logs in, they'll go ahead and have to fill out that data. And then, like what we were talking about with the terms, they'll have to re-sign your terms as well. So whether or not you've changed your application, I think that's a useful thing to do on an annual basis. So you can basically force your volunteers to update their account information or make changes to their account information. Whether or not you've changed your application itself, hopefully you'll catch information like whether or not somebody's moved or if they've changed phone numbers or different things like that. Okay, one last thing about the application itself and collecting some of that information. I alluded to but didn't show custom fields. So if you have some custom questions that you want to ask your volunteers, you can set those up through here. And again, if you have questions about how to establish these, how to collect this information, you can always use our customer support tool. We have a lot of documentation about how these function and how to utilize those. But of course, feel free to submit a ticket as well. And you can also write in your questions today as we're going through this. Okay, so that's kind of updating the application and volunteer profile information. There's one last component to that I want to mention. This is not a new feature this year, but I do want to make sure you're aware of it, and that's custom registration questions. If you have questions that you need to ask your volunteers that are more targeted, that relate to a specific set of volunteers based on what they're applying for or what they're registering for, these custom registration questions allow you to capture that kind of information. So again, we have an entire webinar on this subject specifically, and we also have a lot of documentation on this, so feel free to kind of dive into that further. But again, this is the idea. You have questions that you don't want everyone to answer, only a specific set of volunteers. Okay, so that's your application. Now I want to switch gears here and start talking about, okay, we have people in the system, we have groups in the system, we have opportunities in the system. How do we clean that up? Some of those people are dormant. They haven't worked with us in a long time. You might call them inactive. Maybe they never worked with us. They made a profile and then they just kind of moved on. They didn't actually sign up for anything. So what do we do with those applications? What do we do with opportunities that fell through the cracks or groups that fell through the cracks? So how do we clean up the database, right? Each part of the database has kind of its own ways to handle those sort of dormant accounts or dormant groups or things like that. And really, this is dependent on what you would consider a volunteer who's inactive, right? Or a group that's inactive or an opportunity that didn't take place. That's kind of up to you. Because for some organizations, it's very normal for a volunteer to only show up once a year. For other organizations, if it's been more than a year since that person came in, they're inactive, right? So it really depends on how you treat your volunteers, what you would call inactive. So let's talk about how to identify volunteers in your database that you might consider inactive by using advanced volunteer searches. And then what do you do with those volunteers that you've identified? So in the volunteer database, if we go into advanced volunteer search, there are a couple particular searches that I want to point out. Under the account status options at the top, there is an item in here to search for volunteers that have not had any account activity for more than X number of months. So if you want to find a volunteer that hasn't logged in or signed up for an event or participated within a certain number of months, that's essentially what this search identifies. So this is a pretty quick way to find volunteers that might be inactive in your system. Again, it's up to you what this marker would be, but you can use this search to kind of narrow that down in one particular fashion. Now you can also in here find volunteers based on when their account was created. So maybe you want to combine that information. Is their account over X number of years old and they haven't had activity in more than X number of months? So you could kind of combine those together if you wanted to. There's another section in here that really has to do with this sort of subject, and that's the participation options. If we scroll down, there's a section towards the bottom called volunteer participation options. And in here, you can find volunteers that have served more than, exactly, less than, or between a certain number of times or hours served. Also, all of your impact tracking metrics will show up in here as well. But in particular, this search allows you to do things like show me everyone with exactly 0 times served. And you could say period, don't put any dates in here, so they've never done anything. Or you could say between certain time frames, maybe this calendar year, right? This search is particularly helpful in conjunction with other searches. So for example, if I just say, show me someone who served 0 times, that might kind of falsely flag some people as being inactive, because you might have a volunteer who just created a profile yesterday, but they haven't actually signed up for something. That person has 0 registrations, but they're not necessarily inactive. They're probably going to sign up for something. So typically, if I use this search to identify inactive volunteers, I would combine that with something else, like, for example, going back up, finding volunteers who were entered into service between 2 dates. So, maybe someone who has 0 registrations and they had their profile created in 2023, right? So now I'm not looking at people who made an account this year. I'm kind of giving them a little bit of a grace period and saying, well, maybe they're going to sign up for something this year. But let's go ahead and find all the volunteers who did nothing this year or have done nothing but made their profile last year. So I like to do those kinds of combinations. Again, it's really up to you what you would consider an inactive volunteer. But the combinations of these searches is really a great way to identify those sets of volunteers. While we're on this subject, I do want to point out you can find volunteers that participated in their first activity in a certain time frame in here as well. This can sometimes be useful in conjunction. So maybe you want to say, they've done nothing this year and their first activity was last year. Something like that. That'd be another way to find this kind of set of volunteers. Now, once you've run a search for those volunteers and you've identified that set, you're going to have your listing here. From here, of course, you just have those volunteers. If you want to communicate with them, maybe extend an olive branch and ask them to come back and just invite them to work with you. That's obviously one thing. We do have a whole webinar on volunteer retention, which goes into a little bit more of how you might reconnect with those volunteers. But if we're just saying, okay, these people are inactive, let's just mark them as inactive. First off, I want to mention there is no cap to how many volunteers can be in your database. You don't necessarily have to mark volunteers as inactive. Typically, this is something that you might do just to identify for yourself. Okay, how many active volunteers do I have? How many inactive volunteers do I have, right? Giving yourself some more reporting mechanics and being able to search through your database using those sorts of ideas, right? There is no mandate for you to mark volunteers as inactive. The system will not do that automatically. It is your choice. There's also no cap to how many volunteers can be in your system. So you don't necessarily need to remove old accounts either. You can certainly leave them in there. And I would definitely encourage you to leave old accounts in the system if they have registrations. We're going to talk about removing data here in a little bit. Okay, but if I do want to mark these volunteers as inactive, we kind of already took these steps. I select my results from my search. I use the drop-down menu here and I say update selected volunteer profiles, and then I update their accounts. There are a few settings in here that have to do with kind of identifying active or inactive volunteers. And those are both status settings. So you have the volunteer's status, and there's a lot of data on this page. So if you're having trouble finding things, I like to use the find in browser and just search by a term. But volunteer status and account status are the two that we're talking about here. They're kind of towards the top of the page. So volunteer status, if we go ahead and click on select items to bulk update, this is either active or inactive. This is, again, not something you necessarily have to mark, but this is something that will identify volunteers that you would consider inactive. When someone has been marked as inactive, it does not bar them from engaging with the platform. What it does do is when you send a blast email to your volunteer database, inactive volunteers are ignored. They're effectively unsubscribed from those kinds of messages. They will still get confirmation emails if they happen to sign up for another event. And then, of course, you could go and remark them as active. The account status has three options: unlocked, locked, or disabled. Volunteer accounts will normally float between unlocked and locked. This has to do with their password. If someone uses the wrong password more than 3 times in a row, the system will lock their account. It will tell them your account has been locked, and they'll have to go and do a password reset. It'll tell them how to do that. Basically, they just click a button to have them sent a temporary password. Once that's done, their account will be unlocked and they can log back in. So you don't need to worry about that setting necessarily. The other option in here is disabled. I typically don't use this unless I need to essentially fire a volunteer. Maybe I have someone who I do not want participating in the database. You can set this status as disabled. That will also mark them as inactive, but that will bar the person from logging into this account. Of course, there's nothing necessarily, preventing a volunteer from creating a new profile with a new name or a new email address, but this will lock them out of that particular account. Okay. So yeah, these are kind of normal things that you might use to engage with active versus inactive volunteers. One other thing I wanted to mention is, I kind of alluded to this, but you might have volunteers who you've previously marked as inactive who actually came back, right? So you could run a search in the advanced volunteer search to say, show me volunteers who have been marked as inactive, but that did actually come back. So this is also a search that I would probably run once a year. So say find volunteers who are inactive that served more than 0 times. So instead of exactly 0 times, say more than 0 times this calendar year. So then you could go in and say, show me everybody who I previously had marked as inactive, but actually they came back this year. So I would probably do that search first, mark those people as active, and then go back in and mark what you would consider your inactive volunteers. Okay, one last thing about handling volunteers in your database. You can, of course, remove information. So if you need to delete a volunteer account, you may do that. If we click into Manage Volunteers Profile, we can do this for one person at a time through here, but you can also do this in bulk. Obviously, you want to be very careful with that. Removing information from service is relegated to administrators, so no other access level can do that. But you have the options here to delete an account and anonymize an account. If you want to, you can remove someone entirely from the system. That being said, they cannot have anything associated with their profile. They can't have attachments on their account. They can't have registrations. They can't have hours logged. They can't be listed as a contact in different places. So you'd have to remove all those things first. The system will tell you which of those things exist and have a button to send you to that part of the system to then go and take care of those things. Like I said previously, there's not a cap to how many volunteers that are in your database, so I wouldn't necessarily just go and delete accounts that are older. There's nothing really benefiting you from doing that. You're just removing your own reporting data, so I wouldn't necessarily do that. That said, sometimes people ask you to remove their information, and that's what this anonymize option is for. This anonymize option will take this person's profile and remove all of their personal information. So basically everything that makes it their profile will get removed. But it will retain registration data. So it will convert this profile into an anonymous account. And so it'll retain all the registrations. You'll still have that for your legacy reporting, but all of this person's personal information will be removed from the database. This is a permanent action. There's a big warning here. You cannot undo this. It's effectively the same as deleting that person without touching your reports. So if you do need to delete someone's account info, this is generally how I would do that. And basically you just type out anonymize down here and then you can proceed with that. So it's kind of like a confirmation. Okay, a good question came in about the volunteer profiles and the terms and conditions in particular. I mentioned that volunteers can have up to 10 copies of your signed terms and conditions. Once that 10th copy is reached, the system will then just start dropping off the older copies. So the 10 most recent copies of the signed terms will be persistent in the database. So it doesn't actually matter how old those copies are. It's basically a collection of 10 signatures from the volunteer. Okay, we're going to switch off of the volunteer database side. Obviously, if you have any other questions from that, continue to write those in. Our team will answer them and they'll pass them on to me as well. But we're going to talk about next groups. So basically, how can we manage groups that are dormant or no longer working with you? So if we go under attributes to group management, you can do a couple different things in here to organize your groups. If you know that an organization is done working with you, that there's been some kind of communication regarding that, or perhaps it's a corporate partner that folded or moved away or whatever, you lost your contact. What you can do with those groups, if you go into update the group's information, you can change their status from active to inactive. So same kind of thing as on the volunteer side. This is, again, basically just a marker for you. It's a way for you to identify groups that are active versus inactive. I would normally set this as active when you make a new group, and then obviously you can switch that out if you need to. But the purpose of that is searching, right? You can run searches for groups that are active. You can run searches for groups that are inactive using the advanced search. The other thing that I would do is tie notes into that or use tags to communicate more information if you need to. So if we go in to update this group, we could add another node in here, right? Maybe we lost our contact, or the group was dissolved or whatever, right? I'd write some kind of note in here just to retain that kind of information. When you go into view or manage a group, you'll see all those notes and you can see when it was written and who wrote it. These are not visible to the group themselves. The other thing that you can do is add tags. So adding tags to your groups can be a helpful way to organize them as well. These are very similar to tags on the volunteer database, but they just give you another way to search through your groups and provide some more metrics like that. Okay, one last thing about groups. Again, it's relatively similar, but if we go into run a search here, the advanced search, we can search for groups based on their participation. Now, this is bulk group registrations. If you are using reservations, that's not what this search is querying. So I wouldn't use this as an end-all be-all unless you are only doing bulk registrations with that group. But you can do those kinds of searches through here as well. Okay, so that is groups, or the group side of things. On the opportunity management side, generally, you don't need to do too much in here, but there are a couple things that I want to point out, just kind of about keeping your database up to speed. If we go into search and manage existing opportunities, this page will only by default show you open opportunities, right? So things that have already occurred, those get closed. So you're not necessarily going to see those on this page anyway. The one thing to be cautious of is, if you have a bunch of copies laying around, maybe you want to go and delete those, right? So you could search for events with the word copy in the title to find all of those events, and then you could go and delete those. But again, there's no cap to how many events can be in your system. That's more just for you to kind of clean it up just for yourself. But that's something that I see fairly frequently is if there's unused copies, I would just go and delete those. Obviously, unless you have some kind of purpose for that. So apart from that, there's a couple things that I want to point out. Recently, Service added the option to archive opportunities, which is just another status. I mentioned before, once the end time of an event passes, the system will mark the event as closed. So if we go in and update an event here, we can see there is this opportunity status. Typically, you don't need to touch this. Service will kind of manage it for you. This is normally open. Once the end time passes, it'll get switched to closed. And then after a set time period, it'll get marked as archived. These are just 3 different designations so that you can search through your events a little bit more efficiently. Archived events will only show up when you explicitly search for them. They don't show up in your other searches normally. So these would be things that are much older than your current events, right? You can still include them in your reports. They are still included in reports by default, unless you're searching to exclude them, right? The time frame where an event will get marked as archived is set in your system configuration. So again, you typically don't need to manually change that, but of course you can. But in the system configuration, under the opportunity management settings, there's an option in here that says automatically mark opportunities as archived. This is set to after 5 years by default, but you could set this anywhere from after 1 year to after 10 years, or you can turn it off and then the system will never archive events. Again, the purpose of this is just to create another set so that you're not necessarily slogging through years and years and years worth of data every time you run a search with like a keyword, for example. Because when you do a keyword search, it includes both open and closed opportunities. It will exclude archived opportunities unless you go and explicitly choose that. So just to be very clear about this, if we go into search and manage existing opportunities, all of these searches up at the top here, so searching by opportunity name or tag or keyword, these apply that filter of open and closed by default. If we go into the advanced search, I can say, hey, actually include my archived events and then run a keyword search or run a tag search. So again, you can choose to include them in these types of searches. They're just excluded normally so that you're not always running through so much historical data. Okay, another kind of subject in the vein of making sure your database is cleaned up is marking no-shows. So when you're engaging with your events, if you have volunteers who didn't participate in an event, it's best practice to mark a no-show. Marking no-shows can be done in two places. We can go in here to register volunteers, and then on this page, I can select people that weren't present and then mark them as a no-show here. That does two things. It removes them from the event, and it also adds a no-show note to their profile. The benefit of doing that is then you can search for volunteers based on how many no-shows they've had within a given time frame. So this is, in my opinion, superior to just removing people from an event. If they were actually a no-show, it's better to mark that because then you can at least search by it. Your volunteers aren't necessarily going to be penalized by being marked as no-shows, and they don't really see that data on their profile, but it gives you another searchable metric. So if you would like to go in and say, well, how many no-shows did we have, or how many times did this person no-show? You can see that if you've been marking it on volunteer accounts rather than just removing someone from the event. Of course, it's entirely appropriate sometimes to just remove someone from the event or unregister them. Like if they called you and they told you they weren't going to be there, that's different than someone just not showing up. That's obviously up to you, but I tend to use no-show unless someone told me they weren't going to be there. Now, again, you can do this directly in an event. But if you're using the sign-in console to track attendance, you can also use a bulk action to select multiple events. So right now I'm choosing all my open events. And then in here, I can use the drop-down menu, and there's an option to mark no-shows. This will pull up a list of any person that did not show up for an event that has already occurred. So we get that full list of people who the system thinks, hey, these might be no-shows. You get a chance to vet this. So you could look through the list and say, actually, I remember Sean was there. I'm going to go ahead and sign him in, but everybody else, they're a no-show. I'm going to mark them as a no-show. And then you can kind of take care of that all at once. Obviously, this is an action that I would be taking on a more regular basis, not just once a year, but it is something that's good to be aware of when you're talking about keeping up your database. Okay. We have two more things that I want to talk about today in terms of refreshing your database. And one of those is just checking on your staff. So who has access to your database? In Service, you have the ability to add as many administrators or system users as you need to. So this information basically is up to you. Who do you designate as what role? But a lot of times that can mean that you might have too many administrators, right? People who've left the organization who probably shouldn't have that level of access anymore. So what we should do on a regular basis, again, I'd recommend at least once a year, preferably when people leave their post, but you can go into Advanced Volunteer Search. Using the service account status options, you can search by access level. I think it's good to do these either in bulk or kind of one set at a time, and then just vet that list. So if we select administrators here, click on Search Volunteer Database, I can see everybody in my system who currently has admin access. And if any of these people should not have admin access, I can go in to update their profile. And down at the bottom, I can set their access back to volunteer. You do not necessarily need to worry about trying to remove them from lots of different places. There are, of course, instances where you do want to do that, like removing someone as a contact from an event or putting yourself as the contact instead. But even if you just want to make sure, okay, I just want to remove their access, you can just set them as a volunteer first, and then you could go and move them from different places in the database. You don't necessarily need to make those moves first. Okay, so that's one thing kind of about those different access levels. Like I said, you can go into different parts of the database, like into the opportunity side, and you can just check on who has access to different events. Should that person be listed there? This is a searchable attribute as well. So you can go in and search by opportunities that have a particular organizer listed. So I could search for that person. What I like to do is not necessarily select everything, because some of these are events that have already happened. They're historical, and I would like to know who was the contact when that took place. So what I like to do is run an advanced search by who the contact was. So down here, there's an option to search by opportunities, and then just change things moving forward. So I can go in and select all my events that have a particular person as a contact, choose the date range that I want to look at. So maybe this person left in December. I can search December of this year through December of next year just to make sure I'm catching things in the future as well. And then I can select all those events and then do a bulk update to modify that, right? So I could choose multiple events here. In the drop-down menu, say update those opportunities. And then from there, I can choose what I'm changing. In this case, that's of course the organizer. Okay. There was a question going back to the waivers. I want to make sure to loop back and cover this. And then there's one last thing about refreshing your database. But if we go into the volunteer database and we click on a volunteer's account, we can view their profile details, scroll about halfway through. We'll see those waivers. I mentioned this and I very quickly did this, so I want to go back through and show it again. If we click on this date here for the waiver that the volunteer signed, and again, there might be multiple copies here, but if I click on this, I can download those terms. It downloads a PDF copy of the terms. This has up at the top of the page your letterhead. This is set in your system configuration. If you would like to set a letterhead, you need to submit a ticket to our support team. Below that, it has the person's contact information. Below that, it has the date that you created those terms and conditions. And then it has the actual terms themselves. So what did the person agree to? And then below that, it has their signature information. In this case, it was just the one volunteer who signed it. If it was a minor and there was a parent signature, that would also be listed here. And then you also see when it was signed and then how it was authenticated and then a document seal. Okay, and just as an aside, we do have a webinar on terms and conditions as a whole. So if you need more information about that as a subject, we do have a lot more data about that available. Okay, one last thing about refreshing your database, and this will be relatively quick, but it's always worth considering how are you directing volunteers to your opportunities? What do you have posted? What does it look like for volunteers when they're engaging your events? And how are you sending them to your opportunities? And then also, how does this match your website? Do you need to think about changing some of the terminology, some of the ways you're communicating with volunteers? Do you need to think about the fonts that are being used or the colors that are being used in different places? All of those are things that are just worth considering every once in a while. Maybe you had a major website change this year and you'd like some help kind of directing volunteers to your events or making sure it matches your website, right? Something that's just kind of worth considering on an annual basis at least. So I want to point out in the system configuration, there are a couple sections that relate to this topic. There is a section called Page Content, which contains basically just different welcome messages that you can present to volunteers in different places. This is always something worth considering because this is some of the first text your volunteers see when they're engaging with the platform. So I like to make sure that this matches kind of your branding. Apart from that, there's also a section in here called System Appearance, which is where you'll find things like your logos, as well as down here, all the colors in the console, and then also things like button styles or shapes or input fields, and then down at the very bottom, system-wide fonts. So if you have questions about this, how to make it match your website better, or questions about integrating service into your website, again, we have some webinars on that subject, but we'd also be happy to meet with you to discuss how best to accomplish that. So please let us know. All right. So we covered a lot of information here today as we're talking about engaging or updating your volunteer database. As always, if you have any questions on this subject or anything else, please feel free to use the Need Help tool to search for information or even just submit a ticket to our customer support team. And then I mentioned previously a lot of these subjects that we walked through do also have their own webinars on that very subject. So if you go to video.servicetech.com, that'll take you to our YouTube channel, and we have a lot of those resources in here. So please feel free to kind of peruse through this. We have different playlists built out. The majority of this content is for admin, although there are some for volunteers. And then also you can just click into view our most recent videos if you use that tab.